and we are back again with another episode of We Got That Smoke with none other than Dr. John Henry Clarke.
I would like you, in concluding, to at least get to that issue that entire bodies of work have no legitimacy.
I'm baffled by that introduction about bodies of work. I don't think that has anything to do with anything that either Professor Lefkowitz or I have said. But since you've asked me to conclude something about what we are trying to persuade people of, what I would say is this, that professors...
Hold on, please. I just don't want you to conclude about something that was not asked. So I would like to document it from the book. The contributors to this volume argue that Burnell's claims are exaggerated and in many cases unjustified. You say also in the work, Burnell proposed a radical reinterpretation of the roots of classical civilization, contending that ancient Greek culture derived from Egypt and Phoenicia, and that European scholars have been biased against the notion of Egyptian and Phoenician influence on Western civilization. Since this is a 20-member compendium, I think it suggests that they're attacking a body of work.
In reading the back jacket cover and our description of Professor Burnell's enterprise, that we've been fair to him insofar as what he takes his project to be about. As far as I understand it, I think it is fair. My conclusion about that has to be framed in terms of what the object of that body of work is about. Professor Burnell says that his object, the cultural purpose, political purpose of Black Athena is to lessen European cultural arrogance. My question is, does it lessen European cultural arrogance to argue that early Greek culture was derived from Egypt and or Phoenicia? If we start out from the premise that we study Egypt or Phoenicia for what they contributed to early Greek culture, my opinion is that we are undervaluing Egypt and Phoenicia. And therefore, the project itself is, in the end, essentially Eurocentric and is its own refutation.
I think one can agree with the project of lessening European cultural arrogance completely, and that we applaud all efforts to do so. What we are concerned with is trying to establish what historical evidence shows the influence of what on what. And this is not a project which any of us here can complete at all. That many people must be involved in this, and it requires the thought and efforts of a lot of us to do it. We would like to think that it can be redone without rewriting history altogether, or without claiming that there has been a huge European cover-up of information. There is certainly true. You can claim that, but please remember, you must also show that it has been done. There are many things that Europe has been guilty of and responsible for, and certainly the covering, not the covering up, I don't mean to say that, but the absolute refusal to acknowledge the history of Africa, which I made reference to in my opening remarks, is something that we must continuously work on redressing. Much more must be learned, much more must be studied. I am very much in favor of that, and I believe that it can start also in our teaching of American history, where in many cases the whole history of the African American contribution to American history has been ignored and neglected, and there are brilliant writers out there whose works are not being read. I think we should change all that. But we do not have to rewrite ancient history completely in order to do some of these important things. I would just simply ask, let us investigate carefully the degree of Egyptian influence on ancient Greece, but we must also investigate the Near Eastern cultures such as Phoenicia and the Hittites. After all, Phoenicia gave ancient Greece her alphabet. They didn't learn the alphabet from the Egyptians. It was too hard. It was easier to get it from the Phoenicians. And we must begin to work on those lines. I would like to see everyone work also on a period we haven't discussed much here tonight, where we really do see Egyptian influence on Greek culture, and that is in the Hellenistic period after Alexander got there and Greeks were living in Egypt. A huge number of Greeks were living in Egypt. There, I think you can see some real influence.
This is now the third debate that we have had, and I'm very struck by what I see as a discrepancy between Mary Lefkowicz's speech and her writing. That in speech, she is all sweetness and light and for open debate and openness in culture. Her writing is very different. The title, Not Out of Africa, is extremely provocative, and it reads, the text carries on in the same way. And I'd like to quote to you a letter I received from probably the most distinguished active classicist in the world today, who actually agrees with her on the academic side. Nevertheless, he writes, "I do not find her exposition cool, detached, and reasonable, despite her efforts to make it seem like that. It is, in fact, as I wrote in my review, an impassioned polemic. Of course, Mary wants to look scholarly and detached, but hers is the scholarship of the National Association of Scholars, which is funded by the same people that funded Not Out of Africa, and that leads us back to where Professor Clarke began on the general political context in which this book has appeared."
I would defend Professor Lefkowicz's innocence because she is a pawn in somebody else's game. As I said in the beginning, it is beyond the lack and dislike of Afrocentricity, which has not even developed enough to be called a discipline. It is a world war to prepare the mind to accept the re-enslavement of Africa, to remove from the mind of all people anything good that the African has done, and to ignore the fact that Europe set up Africa to fall apart by imposing on Africa, through miseducated Africans, a nation state. The nation state is un-African. The African thrives at its best in the territorial state. Many cultures, many languages, side by side, challenging each other, fertilizing each other. What you might call an empire, if you study the last 1,000 years before slavery, the development of independent states in the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, Songhay, destroyed by the invasion from North Africa by the Arabs attacking the North African Muslims, attacking the African Muslims, and destroying the great university of Saint-Corey and exiling its greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, who admonished his students, believe in God and and science. The Africans never separated God from science. The priests were scientists. The priest was the most knowledgeable person. That's why you had the concept of a priest God. Now, if they wipe this out of the mind of our children, and our children look at television and sound bites and think they were nothing but a nothing, when they re-enslave Africa, they're going to say, good Lord. They're preparing us to accept it. They're preparing the world to accept the re-enslavement of African people all over the world. And I'm saying that Miss Leskowitz is a pawn in their game. In the tragic irony of it, she is the pawn in the game of people who turn their backs on her people and let them be killed by the millions. American intelligence, French intelligence, British intelligence, the intelligence of the Western world knew exactly what was happening to the Jews in Germany. We raised our voice against this in the old Harlem History Club. 1939 to the death of the leader in 1941. If you think that, if we could get into the nonsense about black anti-Semitism, blacks have always had a sentimental attachment to the Jews. They actually believe the Bible. You know, we are the true believers. We out Pope the Pope, we out Muhammad. But religion has always been a political thing to Europeans, and still is. And when it no longer serves them politically, they're going to discard it. They turn their backs and let this happen. Now they're creating a new game they call Europe and spoil Europe. They want to take some geography outside of Europe. They say the people they're going to take the geography from are unworthy. They can't rule themselves. Of course, they cannot rule themselves in artificial states set up by the Europeans. First thing Africa has to do is to get rid of these borders. Reestablish the borders along the old lines. And integrate Africans into Africa.
Well, now it's the time for you to talk. And again, I'm going to be ruthless. You should have questions, and we're interested in dialogue, not diatribe. All right, they're setting up microphones, I believe. When you ask your question, and hopefully it will be written down so you will not veer off the beaten path, you will ask your question, please, of a specific panelist, and we have such a line of people we want to move along, so please do be considerate. Are we ready?
Now, what the precedents for the library is difficult. Perhaps Aristotle's collection of books in the Lyceum were a precedent, but there were clearly Egyptian libraries per Ankh too. So the idea of a library, I think, is Egypto-Greek, but that library itself was clearly constructed after Aristotle's death and under the domination of Greeks.
Anybody else? Anybody would like to respond? Professor Clarke?
I think the whole concept of the library at Alexandria might be an often repeated myth, and it might not have existed at all. We have not found any foundation. Now, you can burn the building, but you can't burn the foundation because that's underground. Well, according to most information I know, the library, the books in the library consist of raping a lot of small libraries in Egypt. And so when they burned down the library, they burned and lost to the world information that will never be recovered. So I don't think the library was a service, although it is spoken of as a high point of intellectual contribution. It was not. It was part of Greek imperialism, the raping of the small African libraries. He consolidated the books. Had he left them scattered in small libraries, we might still have access to them. But you put them in one place, they got burned down, and the world can never recover that information. So I don't consider the library at Alexandria any compliment to African people or Greeks.
One quick addition to that, quite agree with Professor Clarke that to think of it in terms of any notion of a modern library is fundamentally deceptive. At the time that we do have literary sources for what was in the library at Alexandria, most of that information talks about papyrus rolls. Furthermore, a gymnasium in that time period is not a modern gymnasium, but I think, as the gentleman was implying, was a cultural institution involved with education, military training, and a lot of other activities. So,
better. Anyway, I do believe that your book is a part of this whole scheme, which I believe will be carried throughout this country. But anyway, that aside, I'd like to get onto my questions. I did flip through your book, and meaning flipping through, because I just found it very, for lack of words, I would have to go back to Mr. Clarke's, Dr. Clarke's sophomoric book, because it left many holes, and you contradicted yourself with the very same contradictions that you were blaming all these other authors for having done.
So the question
comes to, was Socrates black? And I felt that you were like beating a dead horse on its head. This is rather than ask that question, I would like to ask you, from this quote, it says, I got it out of a book today, Socrates was prosecuted on a charge of impiety, quote, for not worshiping the gods whom the city worships, for introducing religious innovations, and for corrupting the young men. Now this was, I believe, in the trial of Socrates. And the question being, if so, this is indigenous Greek philosophy coming out from philosophy, and he was eventually put to death by talking about his philosophy and influencing the young minds of Greece, Athens, then I'm not sure if it was Athens or Sparta, I forget. But then my question to you is, what then is so Greek about Socrates? So that's my question to Mary Lefkowitz.
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm certainly glad that
Order.
I'm so Greek about Socrates.
Can I reiterate this again?
No, I think you've asked several questions there. I'm sure glad you like my book so much. But let me just say that Socrates tells us himself that he never really left Athens except on military campaign, and he stayed within Greece. Now, introducing new gods, I think, was a reference to his own personal god, and that's why he was tried for impiety. People did not have their own personal gods. They had to believe in the gods the city believed in. It's a long story. There's a considerable bibliography on that if you're interested. I'm sure somebody at your university could tell you. As for my being part of a conspiracy to destroy all sorts of things, I am not part of any conspiracy at all.
Dr. Clarke, is you going to respond?
I think we many times ask the right question the wrong way. The racism that we know today started in the 15th and the 16th century as a rationale for slavery. Whatever harm the Romans and the Greeks did, they had no racism compared to the racism of today. Otherwise, why would there be 3 African emperors of Rome? And why would there be 3 African popes in the early Roman church? And why would Septimus Severus become the governor of England? The country is going to become England. I'm saying that if you charge the Greeks with the same kind of color prejudice we have today, you're charging them wrong. They've got enough crimes that they're guilty of without that. They had a respect for talent wherever they found it, even among the people they conquered. And the people they conquered had upward mobility to the extent they fitted into the Greek or the Roman political intentions of that day. Now, I have gone to England and had the privilege of going in the basement of the British Museum. As a commoner, naturally I couldn't go, but when they asked the other person with me, what is your authority to enter and look at the sites in the basement of the British Museum? He was a Caribbean person who lived in America most of his life, but he wasn't a citizen, so he had officially been knighted by the Queen. And so he pulled out his card and the door to the basement opened. And we saw the picture of Herodotus, matted hair, pug nose, similar to mine. The statue was in the basement of the British Museum, where it will stay and not on display. But I don't argue Herodotus on the basis of his blackness or anything else. I argue on the fact that he had wandered away from his people. He had learned a concept and a way of living, a way of morality, different from that of his people. So just like Jesus Christ, when he came back among his people, he was preaching something that alien to that place. His food trip, we're driving the money changers from the temple. What do you think we're going to make money? But in other words, what kind of Jew is this? A strange kind of Jew. He don't trust his age and trade. The Romans didn't want to have anything to do with it. So when the Roman governor when he was put on trial for sorcery, the Romans, he wasn't harming the Romans, he wasn't even preaching to the Romans, he was preaching to his own people. And so he pushed them back and said, he's your king. And they pushed him back toward the Romans and said, not my king. But he coming with all those foolish ideas, he kept hanging out in Egypt. So Herodotus has been, I didn't say he went to Africa, I don't know. But he was influenced by African moral law.
Thank you.
Don't know what to read? You can start here.
This question is for Dr. Clarke. Please, could you explain to the right, your left?
The what?
The right, on your right, the two so-called professors on your right.
Well,
on his left, on your right, the agenda of the right and the political context that lets a president of my school, Yolanda Moses, dismantle and ethnically cleanse the ethnic studies and the black studies, the Latino studies, Jewish studies, Asian studies up at City College, and because I have no respect for you, because up at City College we are fighting there every day.
All right.
For what the question is, I want Dr. Clarke to explain how this is, what's this doing to the train of thought in our universities, and how it lets people politically dismantle our universities as we know.
Thank you for your question.
This trend started soon after the Black Studies explosion. Whites began to plan how to let them use this as a political plaything until they got their act together and that strength together in order to destroy it. It wasn't meant to be, no one, if you ever got this simple thing, people never educate you in the technique you can use to take their power away from them. See, education has but one honorable purpose, one alone. Everything else is a waste of time. that to train the student to be a responsible handler of power. No one ever wants us to be responsible handlers of power. I'm saying that it has nothing to do with political lines. The left don't want us to be responsible no more than the right. But they want to dominate us in a different way from the right, and they think they can dominate us better. It's an argument not of whether we will be free, but who will enslave us. And we should have accepted the responsibility of making black studies strong enough to take this assault. We could have anticipated it and argued with it, but we anticipated too much energy arguing among ourselves over triviality. We are partly to blame for what has happened.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Your question, please.
My question is to Drs. Lefkowitz and Rogers. I would like information about the foundation and grants regarding the publication of the book. How did University of North Carolina come to choose them? Did they make the application for the grants? And what are the foundations?
Thank you.
There's a simple answer. There were none. 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 Zero. Zilch. None.
Except for a grant from Wellesley College, right? Now listen, you hear me. Wellesley College student assistants. 2 students who did research paid for by student research grants from Wellesley College. We thank Wellesley College for that.
No, we had no outside grants to write that book at all. The University of North Carolina had nothing to do with funding the book. They simply came to us 3.5 years ago and asked us to put together the book.
So you cite here, you cite in the preface to your book, we are, let me see. We thank Molly Levine of Howard University for generously allowing us to use the bibliography she had assembled, and the Ford Foundation.
That's through Wellesley College.
The Ford Foundation and Wellesley College, not through Wellesley College, for grants to support editorial assistance.
Well, I'm sorry, but the Ford Foundation has a standing grant with Wellesley College through which Wellesley College disperses money to student research assistants. There is no political...
All right, well, that's the answer. The answer is there's no direct foundation link.
Exactly.
But that is as it applies only to Black Athena Revisited, and not to any other work by you, Dr. Lefkowitz.
Question is for Professor Rogers and Lefkowitz. You claim to be in the interest of sharing knowledge and information for the betterment of the students that you teach and the people that you influence. For the duration of this debate, your colleagues on your right-hand side have given you books and information that challenge what you've said. I have not heard anything from you of a willingness to read or reassess some of the conclusions you came through with your book. So what I'd like to know is, now that you've been provided with that information, and if you're truly in the interest of telling the truth and doing the right thing, will you revisit some of what you've written?
Thank you for your question.
We wouldn't be here if we weren't interested in learning other people's views about these topics, but I would urge you to go and look at the bibliography of the book, which is very, very extensive and does, in fact, include many of the titles that we've talked about here this evening.
But that's not the question. The question was, will you, given the information that you've been given tonight by opposing views, let's say, are you going to take another look? Are you going to revisit Black Athena Revisited?
Exactly.
Actually,
that was my question.
We were told by Professor Bernal that he is working on a volume called Black Athena Writes Back, or is that right? So we're waiting for that. We thought it was only fair to give him a chance.
But you really didn't answer my question.
Well, I think I did.
No, no disrespect. I just want to know, now that you've been provided with some of these books, some of the information, names, in the interest of supposed scholarship, would you take a second look at some of the things that they're saying?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. It was noted that that neither Professor Lefkowitz nor Professor Rogers seem to have written down any of the books cited.
Well, that's not fair.
All right, your question, please.
We didn't have to write down all the books because we have actually read a great many of them. I wrote down several notes. If I do not agree with you, it does not mean that I have not read the same books.
Could you, as a graphic designer, could you explain that cover? I mean, you know.
I'm not a graphic designer. The cover was the cover of the New Republic article. Of the New Republic, when my article that was a review of Martin Bernal's Black Athena first appeared.
But you used it on the cover of your book.
The publishers decided to use it again because it was a New Republic book and because they thought people might remember the original cover. It appeared in 1992. It appeared in 1992 when the Spike Lee film of Malcolm X had been very popular and everyone was wearing X caps.
But I see, since we're talking about not out of Africa, how do you get an X cap?
The cover features a bust, I suppose this is Socrates?
Could be, but I think it's generic philosopher.
Is it Plato? Is it, it's not Herodotus. He doesn't have woolly hair.
Well, Herodotus wouldn't have had woolly hair. That was the Colchians and the Egyptians.
But it is a bust of a, I don't know how to describe this, other than you see this kind of sculpture all the time.
Philosopher.
A Homeric figure with an X cap on. Anyway, thanks.
You brought up the subject of anti-Semitism. I want to know, what does that have to do with Black Athena?
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Henry Clarke or Dr. Burnell can answer that. Thank you.
I don't think anti-Semitism should have been brought into the discussion at all, because most people who accuse people of being anti-Semitic have never. Most people who accuse you of being anti-Semitic have not even explained exactly what is a Semitic. It started off as a linguistic term. How did it become a racial term? There are Semitic-speaking people of all colors. So it's not an exclusive thing for the people who adopted the name Jew, mainly in Europe, because the word Jew was not used widely in the ancient world. We knew people of the Hebrew faith, but there are people of the Hebrew faith in India, China, it's a universal religion. A lot of people belong to it, including some misguided blacks who call themselves black Jews. Now, if you want to belong to the Hebrew faith, you just belong to the Hebrew faith. It's all right. Why you have to attach color to it? The Indians don't call themselves, brown Jews. They just call themselves people who belong to the Hebrew faith. And when they went to Israel, they got the shock of their lives by being reduced to second-class citizenship.
All right, can I come back? I think that Black Athena has become involved with anti-Semitism in two ways. That is, in my book, I do spend about half the text, almost half the text, talking about Phoenician influences, that is, Semitic-speaking influences on Greece, and how anti-Semitism among European scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century affected the interpretation of those influences on Greece. So that has one big aspect, and I've been attacked for that by Tony Martin and some others for spending too much time on looking at Jewish or Semitic influences, not Jewish influences, Semitic influences. The other way in which it's become loosely attached to Black Athena is the way in which some, very few, of the people, the African Americans who are, or who claim to be anti-Semitic, have liked Black Athena, but that I think is a much less important issue. I've been fighting anti-Semitism in my book, and this is something that I find extremely central. It may not be central to this audience, but it is very important to me and the way I wrote it.
That
There were some scholars in 18th and 19th century Europe who, for reasons of anti-Semitism, sought to exclude all kinds of people speaking Semitic languages from the story of the origins of Greek culture.
Hotep, Dr. Clarke, may I speak? Yes, go ahead, please. Thank you, sir. We at Temple University, the African American Studies Department, have taken serious Dr. Clarke's question. We're going to be issuing within 2 months a comprehensive document that go back thousands of years. That includes scholars from every part of the African world, including Dr. John Henry Clarke, Fan Fanon, everyone from Charles Hotep. So this will be coming out within 2 months. So this will answer one of the questions that are being raised today. So we're taking a scholarship serious. Now what I want to do, the question is to do to Professor from Wesley. I find the book very disingenuous. I found one person that you mentioned in little inspirational in the book, Dr. Ben, our beloved Dr. Ben Jackson. And I've known him for over 22 years.
Your question, please.
And Dr. Ben, in his 22 years of being a chematologist, had never said one time that he was an Afrocentrist. I mean, why did you say that Dr. Ben speaking at Wesley College was one of the reasons that you picked up on this project to make the Afrocentric project disingenuous? Dr. Ben has never said he is Afrocentric, not one time in the 22 years I've known him, and I know other people that know him like Dr. Jefferson and him probably more years than that. So what is this? Is this poor scholarship, or this just an attempt to continue the attack on Africans?
I was simply talking about an incident at Wellesley when Dr. Ben Yochanan talked about the library at Alexandria and claimed that Aristotle had stolen his works from it. Perhaps the term Afrocentrism has become too widely generalized. We all have been discussing tonight a great many ways in which it's been used and misused. Professor Asante at Temple, as you of course know very well, believes, and I think this is quite true, that he has invented that term, but like all things that one invents, it gets out of hand. So that's my answer. I believe you're right that Dr. Ben refers to himself as a chematologist.
So when George Will, in his review of your book, cited Dr. Ben and this incident in 1993, when he was at Wellesley College, did you correct George Will?
I don't get much of a chance to correct reviews of your book until after they're written.
But it's sent out as part of your promotional package.
Well, I don't send out my promotional package, but I'm not responsible for what George Will writes. I mean, you're making me responsible for absolutely everything in the whole world. It's very interesting. I wish I had this power. What I do with it? Wow.
George Will made the point, the question he made, basically ascribing to Dr. Ben Yochanan this Afrocentric label, and since the article is disseminated to the public and to people like me in media as part of a promotional package for your book, I would imagine that had you had serious differences of opinion with George Will, a conservative writer, about this particular label or association with Dr. Yochanan, you may have either withdrawn that piece of literature from your publicity package, or you may have written directly to Mr. Will and corrected him.
I don't quite see why George Will shouldn't use the language that he wishes to use and be responsible for it himself. That is his prerogative and his problem.
And
you're trying to
and you don't mind inaccurate information being associated with your book?
A great deal of inaccurate information about my book has been associated with it tonight.
Okay, you made it clear.
Is the country of Egypt, do you believe Egypt is a part of Africa? And if not, can you explain why?
If you see a complete map of Africa, Egypt is focused on. Then imagine a woman's body. Egypt is the culture womb of that body. although its original population came from the south, and there's so many documents to prove this, it's not even an arguable point. If Egypt gave birth to a civilization, the impregnation started in the south. And Egypt became the beneficiary of the largest gathering of technology, of technicians in history. Because the Nile Valley stretches 4,000 miles into the body of Africa. When Egypt discovered massive agriculture, she could feed a lot of people, she could house a lot of people. And people with mixtures of gods and beliefs brought it all together into one powerful belief. Egypt was the culmination of several African civilizations, and not just Egypt alone. One of the main reasons the European can't leave it alone, because he did not create it. Why would he come from Europe during the latter part of the Ice Age and create something in Egypt and go back and live under the Ice Age 2,000 years before he built a European shoe? Come on, let's be real now. Let's be real. Why are they so generous to other people when they're not generous to themselves? Europe under feudalism was Europe under slavery, whites enslaving whites. And you study the condition of the European woman during feudalism.
Thank you.
She never had any rights that didn't white so fit to
Dr. Bernal?
Of course, it's part of Africa, and I don't think anybody on this panel would disagree with that.
All right, I just thought I would read this because some of you may think I was making it up. It's from Newsweek magazine from February the 19th, 1996. It's George Will writing in Newsweek, titled The Last Word, and the headline is Intellectual Segregation. Afrocentrism's many myths constitute condescension, he says, George Will of all people, toward African Americans. It begins, in 1993, Dr. Yosef A. Ben Yochanan, who was advertised as, quote, a distinguished Egyptologist, unquote, although he is not a scholar of Egyptian language or civilization, delivered the Martin Luther King Memorial Lecture at Wellesley College. Unfortunately for him and for other Afrocentrists, and that is quoted, and fortunately for the rest of us, Mary Lefkowitz, a scholar of antiquity, teaches there and attended the lecture. So my question still stands. If this is going out as part of your package, this was faxed to me by your publicist today, and I thought that if you disagreed strongly with Mr. Will's characterization, then you would instruct your publicity department to not send this literature out. Next question.
Could I answer that?
Sure.
Could I answer that? I think you would admit that George Will has a right to interpret a text the way George Will feels he should. Is that right or not?
The point is, I'm not disputing what George Will chooses to interpret or not interpret as an Afrocentrist. My question was, why endorse his view by incorporating what you now say you disagree with in your package for publicity? I think it's a self-answered question.
I disagree.
I'm sure you do. Yes.
My question is, hello?
Yes.
My question is to Dr. Clarke, and I'm wondering if, people's work like Mary Lefkowitz and others are going to be used as a kind of an attack dog to resurrect things like 3/5 of a man, penal slavery, and global corporate terrorism. What do you think?
It's a part of the concerted effort, and the effort is international, and it is part of the world war to prepare the mind of people to accept the re-enslavement of Africa. And the irony and the tragedy, Professor Lefkowitz, is that the same people who are going to re-enslave Africa in the morning might turn on her people in the evening.
Thank you very much.
I would like also to augment what I just read from George Will, from Dr. Lefkowitz's own book, Not Out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History. You said tonight that you didn't agree that Dr. Ben Yochanan was an Afrocentrist, but you write in your introduction, you said...
I didn't say that.
Well, let me read what you said.
You can read what I said. I can read what I said.
Normally, if one has a question about a text that another instructor is using, one simply asks why he or she is using that book. But since this conventional line of inquiry was closed to me, I had to wait until I could raise my questions in a more public context. That opportunity came in February 1993, when Dr. Yosef A. Ben Yochanan was invited to give Wellesley's Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Lecture. You've just heard the exact words in George Will's column. Posters described Dr. Ben Yochanan as, quote, a distinguished Egyptologist, unquote, and indeed that is how he was introduced by the then president of Wellesley College. But I knew from my research in Afrocentric literature that he was not what scholars would ordinarily describe as an Egyptologist, that is, a scholar of Egyptian language and civilization. Rather, he was an extreme Afrocentrist, author of many books describing how Greek civilization was stolen from Africa, how Aristotle robbed the Library of Alexandria, and how the true Jews are Africans like himself. Now, it's almost verbatim what George Will wrote, and it was just there, he said so what didn't you disagree with Dr. Ben Yochanan? What label would you now agree that he is? Dr. Lefkowitz.
Well, I think you are trying to make me say what I didn't say. I never said that. You read what I said. That's what I stand by. I use, maybe you don't agree with the way I use the term Afrocentrism. You think it's wrong. You maybe, no, I'm not.
All right, let's leave it right there for the moment so you may cogitate upon that. Yes.
You can read what I write and you can judge me, and you are judging me, so go right ahead, be my guest.
However, I find that to be very disturbing, because within the last 600 years, I mean, you can look at the last 600 years and you can find many, many things that need to be revised in our history, in the way we are teaching our history to our young right now. If you don't see that, okay, let me ask you, what would you change? What would you revise within the last 600 years of our history that is being taught now, all right, to our children, all right? That we have to come in, when our children come home every day and, we see what they're being taught about Columbus, they're still calling natives Indians, all right?
Your question.
What would you change? And how soon would you think would be, what is quick enough for you? I mean, should we take 10 years to change these things?
Thank you.
Every time, history must be rewritten and rethought and reconsidered. And in the light of the progress, if there has been any progress, I think there has, then we can rewrite every history, but we do not rewrite the basic facts of history, which are things very simple. Let me just tell you things you have to stick by. In writing the history of the Civil War in this country, either you have to say Lee surrendered to Grant or Grant surrendered to Lee. Both didn't happen. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We can't rewrite those basic facts, but we can rewrite interpretations, and there's been a great deal omitted in the history, and maybe you've cited some terms that are condescending, terms that should not be used anymore. That's another example of something that can be done. But I'm not going to be able to rewrite in my lifetime the whole of the school curriculum. That's up to all of us.
I think that that's a very good and fair question. My answer to that is that what worries me the most is not rewriting history, because history is always provisional. we try as human beings, with the evidence that we have, to build up a picture which, in the best circumstances, is as accurate and as true to the evidence as we can find it. What worries me, and to speak, I hope, directly to your point, is history which is being written for useful purposes. What worries me about that is that when you say useful, what is useful to one person may lead to very significant problems for someone else. And in the 1930s and in the early 1940s, there were groups of people in Italy and in Germany who wrote useful histories about minority groups. Those useful histories ended at places like Auschwitz and Treblinka. And that is exactly the reason why.
Excuse me, please. We must have some order.
The standard for our revisions has to be, I believe, accuracy and truth as far as we can establish it, based on probability, since history is not an exact science.
Dr. Clarke?
Let's stop talking about usefulness and talk about honesty. Let's talk about the making of the United States, the design of this country. It was designed as a haven for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who own property. Everybody else in this country who think this country was designed for them are telling themselves a lie. The Jews were out of it, the Catholics were out of it, the Quakers were out of it. Now look at who's held power in this nation. Only one non-Protestant president. And how long did they last before they killed him? When they said liberty and justice for all, that's the all they were talking about. The other people think they were talking about them. The country have not betrayed any promise to you, had even made any promise to you. Wasn't even talking about you in the first place. Let's tell the real truth about all the founding fathers being slaveholders. Let's read the letters George Washington wrote when he wanted some special molasses from the Caribbeans, and he offered to send one train nigger as payment for the molasses. Let's not take George Washington out of history, but let's put the blacks in history along with him. Let's talk about James Fortan, who made the tents for George Washington. And George Washington found that those wax-matted cloth for the tents was stronger than the cloth in the breeches of his soldiers. He asked James Fortan to make some breeches of that same cloth. Those breeches made by a black man turned that terrible third and fourth winner of the American Revolution. Don't take George Washington out, but put James Fortan in with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Bernal?
Is this a response to a question?
If you want to just add something, if you had a chance.
Are we still going on with questions?
No, questions are done.
The questions are done?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think this has been, there's been some intellectual blood spilt, but I find it very interesting. But I'd like to end on a note that Mary Lefkowitz raises in her book, a point raised many times by Arthur J. Schlesinger, Jr., that Afrocentrist history is purely an attempt to promote group self-esteem, whereas history, and I'm quoting, should consist of dispassionate analysis, judgment, and perspective. In fact, this desirable goal is very seldom reached in schools, which nearly always stress the achievements of the dominant group or the majority group in that school. Nevertheless, I quite agree with them that one should try to transcend these intellectual or social environments and achieve objectivity as far as it's possible to do so. However, classics, based as it is in what I call the Aryan model, with its insistence on a European and pure Greece, is an extreme example of feel-good scholarship for Europeans.
Don't know what to read? You can start here. Okay, that would keep you going for a while.